We've got to be aware of how we're talking about ourselves. We've got to be aware of the messages that are going out and what's behind those messages, like big profits, for example. We've got to be aware, I think, particularly of nonverbal communication, how we hold ourselves, how we project ourselves, the volume, all those things that we do. Our nonverbal communication is really important.
Hello, and welcome to Not Born Yesterday, a podcast dedicated to older adults and the challenges and joys of aging. I'm Miriam Goodman.
Not Born Yesterday is brought to you by Next Village SF, a local nonprofit providing older adults in the Northeast neighborhood of San Francisco with support to help age in place. I'm Lynn Winter-Gross.
Today on Not Born Yesterday, we're going to talk about ageism again. But this time we're concentrating on ageism and how it affects women differently than men. If you haven't experienced age bias yet, either you ignored it or told yourself it was someone else's problem. And you certainly know women who've been on the receiving end of age bias. As older adults, we all need to understand the power dynamics around ageism and the challenges we face. Too many of us, women and men alike, have felt the stigma of being invisible as we age. We may feel ignored in shops and restaurants, talked over at meetings or workplace situations, and overlooked in social situations and even within our own families.
Our guest today believes we should fight back when confronted with ageism for our own good. Paula Usery is an educator and retirement coach, and she's an expert on positive aging. Her book, Refusing to be Invisible, offers remedies and solutions to all the negativity associated with aging. Paula, we're so happy to have you here today to help us see that aging has become cool and that we can now age positively. Welcome to Not Born Yesterday.
Thank you for inviting me on your podcast. I really appreciate this and look forward to our discussion.
Well, Paula, you've written that we live in a culture that continually celebrates youth and beauty and denigrates aging. And of course, it's challenging to accept that we are different and look different than we did when we were younger. But where does this cultural bias come from?
It's pretty deeply embedded in our culture. It's not anything new, but certainly advertisers, media have helped promote this. And the anti-aging industry, for example, is a $14 billion industry, at least as of 2020. So we're always getting and I love the word anti-aging. I'm being sarcastic, but anti against aging is what we've come to accept as normal. And that has further, I think, separated this notion of that you're either old or you're young. And being old is not good. Being young is preferred. So we get a lot of pressure trying to be something that we aren't and shouldn't want to be anymore.
So what should we do when we start to feel invisible, not noticed?
Not noticed. And I think that really depends on the circumstance. I mean, I think the very first thing that we have to do is to become aware of what's going on and why. If we aren't aware, we don't notice it. We don't see what's happening. And so just starting to say, okay, there is a prevailing view in our culture, paying attention to the language, watching how other people are treated who are older. And then for me, it was the big ha. It's not because I'm wearing the wrong clothes today. It's not because I'm having a bad hair day. This is consistently happening. People are talking to me in a different way. They're ignoring me maybe when I'm going shopping, but it has to start with some awareness that this is something that is happening, not just in the United States, but globally. Ageism, and the World Health Organization talked about it as a prevailing form of discrimination that we just simply, basically say ignore. We allow it to happen. So we have to first recognize it. And then depending on the circumstance, I think we have to intentionally think about how we're going to respond and call it out. We call it out if we're angry. If we get upset, which sometimes it really irritates you, but if we act in a flash of anger, that reinforces in other people's minds that, yeah, she's just being a crabby old woman. So we have to be careful of how we handle that.
Can you give me an example? Can you give us an example of how you felt invisible and what you did?
Oh, I have felt invisible a lot of times, but not so much anymore. But when I first started feeling invisible, one example would be I was a department chair where I taught, and I was the one conducting the meeting. But then I noticed people were talking over me and interrupting me. And at first, I'm thinking, why is this happening? How could this be happening? And I finally, as I thought about it and realized, okay, I need to make sure I am sitting, um, with a straight back, uh, looking like I am in charge, and then asserting myself a little bit more, holding my hand up when somebody is interrupting me, for example. Those are things I could do, but I had to think about it and think, okay, I have to change my behavior. I used an example in my book about a woman I knew who, at the time, she was in her early 60s, but she chose how she was going to present herself. And I think it was very deliberate, but she would walk with a erect posture again, walk into a room that commanded attention. She'd look at people with really good eye contact, and she would project her voice. Nothing said, I'm invisible. She was very present. And we have to do that deliberately. We have to make our presence known. I'm shopping. I will give somebody eye contact, and I'll stand with my feet hip width apart. And I will use a stronger voice if I need to, I love this shirt over here. Would you give me a hand? Rather than make myself smaller, which we tend to do when we feel invisible. I have to make myself bigger.
I think it was a little empowering when Kamala Harris and Mike Pence were having their debate.
Yes.
And he kept trying to interrupt her. And she said, I'm talking, I'm speaking. And she really stood up for herself. So
Yes.
I hope that gave us all a little bit of confidence. But, we here at the podcast tell our listeners all the time that our accumulated knowledge and experience are valuable, no matter how old we are or how we look. And whether somebody tries to dismiss us, we know we're interesting. We know we're worthwhile people. But how do we find role models, or how do we embrace what's ahead of us, educate ourselves so we can feel like we're living life to the fullest?
I think there are all kinds of examples around us that we just have to pay attention to. And I know Gail Collins wrote a book, and the title right now just doesn't come into my mind right away, but she wrote about women, older women. And one of my favorites is Susan B. Anthony. And I just thought, in spite of all the challenges as she fought for a woman's right to vote, and she faced a lot of opposition, a lot of challenges, but she was strong because she was very committed to what she was doing. She had a very strong sense of purpose. And I thought, powerful example.
You've talked about making an action plan for getting older and following the action plan. What is that? And it seems like that's what you're talking about.
Wishful thinking is not a plan. We wish that we would do things differently. We wish that we would get more involved in, activities that help us grow, or fitness things that we could do to improve ourselves. But we have to actually put that wish into action to make it something that we realistically start doing. So for me, an action plan would be like, for example, I started playing the flute after 50 years of not doing it. And so I had to say, okay, if I want to learn this, I can't just look at the flute or even buy one and look at it in the corner. I have to have some kind of plan to consistently develop the skill that it's going to take to play it again. And right now, I don't sound terrific, but I'm getting better. And so what I would do as an action plan, I'd say, okay, I'm going to practice at least 15 minutes a day for at least 5 days a week. Now, there have been a couple days where I practiced 10 minutes, and I say, okay, Paula, that's okay as long as you are aiming towards about 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week. So and then I say, okay, I'm going to work on certain things each week as well. So that becomes part of my action plan. Does that make sense? Am I
So the
explaining that?
action plan is keeping you focused, keeping you finding purpose, finding intention.
And tracking it specifically with specific measurements.
And how is this related to aging and aging well?
That is because as we're going through transitions as we go in, get older. And one of the challenges I think a lot of people have is I'm getting older. There's nothing I can do about it. I see myself as my grandmother. I'm, why bother to learn? Why bother to take care of myself? I'm old. I am old, and I like being old. That doesn't mean that we quit living. That means we start living in a new and I think a much more interesting way, taking care of ourselves, having goals, moving forward and we have the freedom to do that is one of the most wonderful things I think I'm finding about being, in my case, a 71-year-old woman. I love it.
You've talked about this is such a great time in your life. You love being older. Why do you
I
love
do.
it? We always think of it as the worst time. This is not a happy time. Our kids are gone, our job is done. But you say you love it. This is the best time of your life.
You're not raising kids. You're not working anymore in a regular job. What's not to love? You get to explore all the things that you never had time to explore before. You get to, I think, as a woman in particular, because so much is put on us, we're not supposed to have a life of our own. We're not only, working and raising children, maybe, if that happens to be the case, but everybody, because you're female, you're expected to take care of everybody else as well. So all of a sudden you find yourself, um, I get to choose. For some women, particularly for women, all of a sudden being in that place is kind of scary because a lot of women don't think about that. They don't think about what do I want my life to look like? How is that going to be different? And especially when you go from maybe a career to post-career living, if you haven't really thought about that, that's going to be a little bit of a struggle. You have to think about what's that going to look like? What do I want it to look like? And then also recognizing, I think it's very important that even when you do that planning, some of the things you plan for outside of anything financial could change considerably.
Well, to get back to the issue of invisibility,
Mm-hmm. Yes.
One of the things you say is that we need to live with purpose.
Yes.
And how do we do that at any age and make sure that we're not invisible as we live with purpose?
I'm going to go back to Susan B. Anthony. And what is interesting to me, and I used to teach public speaking, so I love to use her as an example. She had a huge fear of public speaking. A lot of people might not know that because she became the voice of the first wave of women's rights, feminism. She became that first voice. But she would talk about how she'd almost wilt after giving speeches. She hated doing it. Yet she felt so strongly about women being visible, women's abilities to have a voice, that's being visible, that she was able to, because of that purpose, because she had this strong sense of purpose, she was able to go out and be the voice, the primary voice during a period when it was very challenging. And I think that's what purpose does for us. It helps us to say, pay attention to what I have to say or what I'm doing because it's important. It's important and it's bigger than ourselves.
Is there anything that you would like to make a list about, saying these are 10 ways or 5 ways to not feel invisible?
I think it starts with certainly number one, awareness, but being aware of our internal self-talk. We hear things that are negative and then we internalize that. And there's really good research. One of the, I think, the best books or one of the best pieces of research has come from Dr. Levy has done a lot of work on this. And if we internalize it, we can actually shorten our lifespan by, as she says, up to 7.5 years. We've got to be aware of how we're talking about ourselves. We've got to be aware of the messages that are going out and what's behind those messages, like big profits, for example. We've got to be aware, I think, particularly of nonverbal communication, uh, how we hold ourselves, how we project ourselves, the volume, all those things that we do. Our nonverbal communication is really important. Role models, that's another thing we can do to not feel invisible. We look at other women and say, that's who I want to be. I want to be like that in this area. Then we take on that power that we see illustrated in other women. And I think certainly working side by side with other women, advocating for more respect for all people, doing things like I participated in a women's march. I was probably one of the older participants, but I was letting people know, I was standing there with a lot of younger people. I was dressed as Susan B. Anthony, which was fun, but I wanted people to know I stand with you. I stand for you. A lot of the issues women were marching for were issues that don't necessarily affect older women today, but they're all of our issues, and we're standing in solidarity. That's, I think, part of feeling visible, and then having a really good sense of your own purpose. Why are you here? What kind of a legacy do you want to live? And if we allow ourselves to be invisible, that's not going to happen in the same way, to the same degree. I'm on a mission. I think we all are on missions. We just have to remember that. And then there's no stopping us.
Paula, thanks so much for your insights. Our guest today was Paula Usery, author of Refusing to Be Invisible.
As people age and retire, they often take a second look at where they want to live. Perhaps their children have moved far away and they want to be closer to them. Maybe their home of many years seems too large or requires major revisions to make it comfortable for aging occupants. There are many reasons to move, but sometimes there are just as many reasons to stay. So today on News You Can Use, we want you to know about another type of aging in place. We recently talked about co-housing as an alternative to living alone as we age, and NORCs are another version of staying where you are and yet being connected to a community.
In some parts of the country, there is a phenomenon called natural occurring retirement community, or NORC, N-O-R-C. A NORC is a community or a neighborhood with a population of older adults in which the dwellings were not purposely intended for the specific age groups when they were originally designed. It can be an apartment building or a group of townhouses or garden apartments, even a block or two of homes where residents who have been there for many years have grown old together, thus naturally occurring. The common link is that the residents have chosen to age in place together, and they offer support that enables residents to stay as long as they want. The result is that the residents often share tasks, help each other, and generally keep an eye on their fellow residents. A NORC is not a senior living facility with meals or on-site medical care. It's a self-sustaining residential building or community where the residents continue to age in place in their own apartments or homes.
For example, in one apartment building where all the residents are now seniors, by accident more than by design, there are still only a few who can drive. The drivers have taken the responsibility to take others to doctor appointments, organize trips to the supermarket, or even arrange excursions to parks or concerts. In return, others who may not be as mobile cook or bake a little extra and pass it on to the residents who are not so adept in their own kitchens. And residents check on others who live alone to be sure each is able to get up in the morning or hasn't had a fall or illness since the day before. Others organize bridge clubs, book groups, and field trips for the residents. This is a great example of a NORC, and they exist all over the country.
This movement has its roots in New York City, where population density in high-rise apartment buildings or complexes created the conditions for many of the early NORCs to evolve. Today, there are NORCs in smaller urban areas and in some rural communities.
Most NORCs are not regulated like other senior housing, but some communities have organized enough to work with local social service agencies in their cities. The common wisdom is that it is better to keep people in their own homes than to force them into assisted living situations where they know no one and feel lost without their friends and familiar surroundings. For those who own their own homes or apartments, they don't necessarily need to adjust to a new environment or abide by someone else's rules. Some cities with programs like Aging in Place or Retirement Health Services actually send social workers and nurses to make house calls, help get prescriptions filled, and generally keep residents healthy at home.
Like so many other good ideas, aging in place efforts like NORC's need public and private support to really be effective. Perhaps now that we boomers have reached older age and confront housing issues, this could be our next step in changing the world. If you are interested in finding out or starting one in your community, go online or check with your local Office of Aging. There are pros and cons with living in this kind of situation, but if you like where you live and don't want to move, a NORC may be an attractive option. And that's our podcast for today. Our thanks go to our guest, Paula Usery, author of Refuse to be Invisible. You can learn more about Next Village SF at their website, nextvillagesf.org. Our theme music is from Hook Sounds, and Jason Dahlstad is our engineer. And thank you for listening. We'd love to hear what you would like us to discover and discuss. Please contact us at notbornyesterdaypodcast.org. Be well, stay strong, and remember, you weren't born yesterday. I'm Lynn Winter Gross.
And I'm Miriam Goodman.